Good evening and thank you for joining me on Black News Tonight. I'm Marc Lamont Hill. Today is a very, very special episode of the show as we mark and honor the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On January 15th, 1929, Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia. And when he was born, there was absolutely no way to anticipate that we would be witnessing the emergence of one of the greatest human beings this country, indeed this world, has ever produced. And every year, now we celebrate Dr. King's life and legacy. Every year, stores shut down. It's a federal holiday. Companies have special programs. Schools bring in speakers, all to honor this man who helped lead us on a journey toward a greater and richer and more full democracy, a deeper understanding of our racial wounds, and a call for economic justice in the United States and around the world. But the first thing we have to do when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. is be honest about that life and legacy. Right now, everybody celebrates King Day, but it's only been a few decades since there were protests against Martin Luther King Day. There were marches, there were protests. Stevie Wonder made a whole song, Happy Birthday, in direct response to the struggles on the ground to make this happen. So please don't let our political enemies, please don't let the enemies of justice make you think that they've always liked or always loved Martin Luther King Jr. No, this is a day that is born out of struggle. The second thing we got to think about when we talk about the life and legacy of Martin Luther King in terms of Martin Luther King Jr. Day is that this is not a day of service. Yeah, people say, oh, on King Day, it's a day of service, and people feel good about themselves giving out some muffins at a shelter or handing out some hats or reading to children. Let me be very clear. You should do all of those things. You should donate. You should serve. You should be generous. We should do those things every day, and there's nothing wrong with doing it in the spirit of Dr. King, because Dr. King would want us to do those things. But that's not what Martin Luther King Jr. Day should be about. That's a domesticated MLK Day. That's a cheapened MLK Day. No, MLK Day has to be a day of radical action. On MLK Day, we should be talking about how to get us free. On MLK Day, we should be talking about how to feed the poor, not just on a given day with some food, but how we can restructure this economic system so that we don't have such a big gap between the have-gots and the have-nots. We shouldn't just be talking about anti-war as a sentiment. We should be talking about how we can reimagine this country, this American democratic experiment, so that war is no longer our primary instrument of foreign policy. That's what King would want us to do. On MLK Day, we can't think about King simply as a feel-good, happy Negro preacher that wanted black and white people to sit together at the table of brotherhood. No, no, no. When we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., we have to think about him as a radical. What does this word radical mean? What does it mean to call King a radical? Radical simply means to get at the root. King wanted us to get at the root causes of our social problems. King didn't want us to just give out money. He wanted America to do something special. As he said, America did something special against the Negro, therefore America must do something special for the Negro. He's talking about structures. If we're going to talk about King, we have to be honest about what the man said. Everybody wants to talk about the March on Washington. Everybody wants to talk about August 28, 1963. Everybody wants to talk about the I Have a Dream speech. But what they don't want to do is tell you what the speech was really about. That speech was not about dreams. That speech was about broken promises. When King makes a decision to give that speech and to have a March on Washington. Remember, it's the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. He wanted black folk to get jobs and freedom. The march was 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. He was saying 100 years after Lincoln freed us, we still ain't free. Martin Luther King Jr. made a decision to stand in front of Lincoln. When he gives a speech, he says, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed an Emancipation Proclamation. He refers to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Emancipation Proclamation as what? promissory notes. He's saying they're like money. And he says the Negro's check has been returned insufficient funds. He's saying the nation hasn't owned up to its promise. He said the Negro stands on a vast island of poverty amidst an ocean of material wealth and prosperity. King is saying the nation owes us something. The nation has something. The nation is built on our backs, and they haven't given us what we want. So when you talk about that dream, the dream isn't just for blacks and whites to sit together. That's important to King, but it's undergirded by a belief that the nation must repair the damage done. Repair the damage done. Reparations. King is calling for reparations. So as we think about the life and legacy of King, we can't just let these people have you thinking he was a Negro preacher that wanted everybody to sit together, black, white, red, and yellow. Yes, that's important, but more important, more substantive, is King challenging America to be as good as it's supposed to be as good as its promise, and to honor the promise that it broke to black folk everywhere. So when you remember King, remember that he was a radical freedom fighter, that he was a revolutionary, and also remember that King did not die popular. King died an enemy of the state. King was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in '63. He couldn't make People Magazine's Most Admired Americans list by the time he died in '68. Morehouse College wouldn't put King on the board of trustees. They said he was a bad influence on young people, that he went to jail too much. King was kicked out of his own Baptist convention. They say he was a troublemaker and he was too vain and he wanted to be on TV and he wanted to be in the cameras too much. The White House stopped talking to him. The same spirit that made him popular, telling Negroes not to fight back, made him hated by the state when he gives that speech on April 4th, 1967 in Riverside Church against the Vietnam War, saying my nonviolence ain't just when police are beating us, it's also when we're killing the Viet Cong. King had a moral consistency that radical politics must demand at all times. So when King gives that speech at Riverside on April 4th, 1967, it's no surprise that he was murdered on April 4th, 1968. And regardless of who pulled the trigger, the U.S. government watched him. They surveilled him. J. Edgar Hoover harassed him. He wrote him letters hoping that he would kill himself, literally saying, I want you to commit suicide. This is what King faced. This is who King was. So don't let anybody lie to you about Dr. King. And we're not going to let anybody lie to you about Dr. King. That's why tonight on Black News Tonight, we're going to tell the truth. I got some brilliant scholars, they got some brilliant analysis, and we are going to let you know exactly what the King legacy is, what it's supposed to be, and what we can do to sustain it. Everybody, also, we want to make sure we hear from you. Go to our BNC Twitter and Instagram pages. Let us know how you feel. Also, go to our YouTube channel, BNC News, and watch clips from the show.